My greedy sister once sent her own son into my hallway to steal my credit card, not even pausing to wonder if I would notice, not even thinking of what that meant for her child, and all because she wanted to fund her lavish wedding without lifting a finger herself. But what she didn't know was that her groom carried a secret so dangerous that her fantasy day would soon collapse in front of every guest she hoped to impress. If you have ever been blindsided by family betrayal, if you have ever had someone you loved use your trust against you, then you know the ache that settled in my chest when I realized what she had done, and if my story touches something in you, your small support means more than you can imagine, because every like or comment helps me keep telling stories like this, and I truly treasure every person who takes the time to stand with me and remind me I am not alone. My name is Lauren Bennett. I am 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the one who lives by the book, who works hard, who balances her checkbook down to the last cent and saves for rainy days while others spend as if the sun will never set. I live in Massachusetts in a modest but comfortable townhouse that I bought through years of careful saving, a home that may not sparkle with luxury but carries the glow of something earned through patience and discipline. Every item inside it tells a story of sacrifice, from the second-hand dining table polished until it shines to the shelves stacked with books I've collected since college, each purchase deliberate, each dollar accounted for. My career in accounting suits me because numbers make sense when people do not, and the order of a balanced spreadsheet is often the only calm I have in a family that thrives on chaos. Stability may sound dull to some, but to me it is freedom. And in a world where drama waits around every corner, I cling to it with pride. My sister Vanessa, however, has never valued restraint, never respected limits, and from the time we were children, she was always the one who wanted more, reaching for what wasn't hers, and laughing when someone else paid the price. She is 36 years old, 3 years older than me, and yet she carries herself as if she is younger, as if the world owes her endless second chances. People see her glossy hair, her designer outfits, her confident smile, and they mistake her performance for substance, falling for her charm while overlooking the trail of debts and disappointments she leaves behind. At family gatherings, she knows how to shine, how to laugh at the right moment, how to win sympathy with a flutter of her hand, and most people never notice the way she manipulates those closest to her. For years, she has leaned on me as if my steady life was built to prop up her unstable one, as if being the responsible sister meant I had to fund her mistakes, excuse her behavior, and play the role of her silent safety net whenever her dreams crumbled. It was no surprise when her engagement became the talk of the family, because she made sure it was, turning every conversation into a performance about the man she called her perfect match, Colin, who looked the part of a charming gentleman but always gave me the feeling of something too polished, too smooth, like a mirror hiding a crack. Vanessa boasted about the grandeur of her wedding, about the floral arrangements, the designer gown, the glittering reception that would make her friends jealous and our neighbors gasp, but everyone knew, even if they didn't say it, that she didn't have the money for what she described. Still, she carried herself as if it was all already paid for, as if the universe itself would deliver what she demanded, and for a while I let myself believe that maybe she had figured something out. Maybe she had grown up and planned wisely. That illusion shattered when the first small charge appeared on my bank account, a sum so modest I might have ignored it, but then came another, larger, and then another, until the alerts on my phone felt like alarm bells. My stomach tightened as I recognized the names: a bridal boutique, a florist, a catering company. These weren't random errors or stolen numbers used by strangers. They were linked directly to Vanessa's wedding, to the very fantasy she bragged about, and I knew then that the betrayal was not only real, but personal. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and worse, she had dragged her own son into the shadows of her scheme. That night as I lay in bed, staring at the glow of my phone, I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and a strange, sharp clarity. This wasn't just about stolen money. This was the first breadcrumb leading me toward a truth so dark it would destroy everything she thought she was building. and I was the one who would have to follow it. The first charges were only the beginning, and soon they began multiplying like ivy crawling across the side of a house, impossible to contain once the roots had settled deep. What started as a small sum became a cascade of charges: $1,000 deposit for custom floral arrangements, a hefty payment to a wedding planner who specialized in elite experiences, and a staggering invoice for a venue I had only seen in glossy magazines. Each notification from the bank felt like a punch in the gut, not because I couldn't survive the loss financially, though I worked too hard for that money to see it vanish, but because every transaction screamed of deliberate betrayal. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Vanessa had chosen to take from me rather than face her own limits, and in her mind, I would either stay silent or shoulder the shame of calling her out. The more I stared at the growing list of charges, the more I realized this wasn't just theft, it was arrogance. I tried to confront her gently at first, without revealing everything I knew, testing the waters to see if she would admit to anything, but she brushed me off with that practiced laugh of hers, the one she used to silence questions at dinner parties. She claimed I must have mixed up my own purchases, that maybe I had signed up for something I forgot, and when I didn't bite, she smiled in that icy way of hers and said she was too busy planning her wedding to discuss my paranoid ideas. What stung more than her dismissal was the way she positioned herself in front of others, painting me as the overly cautious younger sister who worried too much, who lived small while she aimed higher. Our mother nodded along at the table, reminding me that Vanessa deserved her moment of joy, and an aunt even whispered that maybe I could loosen up and help out since I was so good with money. The room closed in on me, and I felt my cheeks burn as if I were the selfish one for questioning charges that didn't belong to me. It was a familiar game, Vanessa manipulating the spotlight until I looked like the villain and she looked like the victim. The charges didn't slow down. In fact, they grew bolder, as though my silence was an invitation. There were back-to-back charges for champagne shipments, deposits for a string quartet, and even a rush fee for embroidered napkins that carried her initials entwined with Colin's. The carelessness of it almost made me laugh, as if she thought she was royalty planning a televised spectacle rather than a small-town woman marrying a man none of us really knew. But underneath my bitter humor, the fear clawed at me. What if she had already maxed out her own cards? What if she was counting on me not just for deposits, but for the entire wedding bill? Each new alert from my bank was like a clock ticking louder, reminding me that if I didn't act, she would drain me dry and leave me with nothing but her excuses. I tried to tell myself to breathe, to stay calm, to collect evidence instead of exploding, but it wasn't easy. Every time I walked into a family gathering, I could feel her eyes on me, daring me to speak, daring me to shatter the illusion she had built around herself. She flaunted her wedding plans in front of anyone who would listen, describing chandeliers dripping with crystals and floral arches taller than the guests. And every detail she spoke felt like another withdrawal from my account. She had no shame, no hesitation, and what made it worse was the silent pressure from the rest of the family, their unspoken expectation that I, the steady one, the practical one, would carry the burden because wasn't that what I always did? But something in me shifted as the charges grew. I realized that if I didn't draw the line now, she would never stop. And worse, she would teach her son that using others was acceptable. That thought lodged itself deep inside me like a stone, and I knew I couldn't let this go on. One evening, determined to find proof of what I already suspected, I sat down to review the footage from the small security camera I had installed by my front door, a habit I picked up after a few packages went missing from the porch. I scrolled through the timestamps until I saw a figure move across the frame, and my stomach clenched when I recognized him. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a thief in a mask. It was Ethan, my 15-year-old nephew, moving with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was doing something wrong. His eyes darted left and right, his shoulders hunched, and I watched in silence as he slipped through the hallway, reached toward the table where my purse sat, and slid something into his pocket. My throat tightened as I realized exactly what he had taken. It wasn't only a card, it was my trust. The image burned into my mind long after I turned off the screen. I felt anger rise in me like a storm, but it wasn't directed at Ethan, not fully, because I knew this wasn't his plan, this wasn't his scheme. He was a child caught in the net his mother had thrown, pressured into playing a part in her endless hunger for more. My fury, sharp and unrelenting, was for Vanessa. What kind of mother would send her own son into the shadows, teaching him to steal, to lie, to betray family? It wasn't just cruel, it was corrupting, poisoning him with the idea that deception was normal, that taking what you want is acceptable if you smile wide enough afterward. That night I lay awake, torn between the rage I felt and the sorrow that pressed heavy on my chest, because I could not let Ethan become collateral damage in his mother's greed. The contrast between us weighed on me more than ever. I remembered being his age, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, clipping coupons out of the Sunday paper, learning to stretch every dollar and celebrate the small victories of saving. Those afternoons taught me responsibility, the quiet strength of discipline, the satisfaction of building something from patience. Ethan, instead, was learning how to sneak and steal, how to trade integrity for obedience to his mother's schemes. That thought cut deeper than any charge on my account ever could. I knew then that I had to separate my anger at Vanessa from the boy she had dragged into this mess, and I had to make sure he understood that he wasn't alone, that he still had someone willing to see him as more than a pawn in her game. But as much as I wanted to storm into Vanessa's house, as much as I wanted to confront her in front of everyone and demand she explain herself, I stopped. That would only push Ethan deeper into her grip, make him feel exposed, humiliated, and likely blamed for everything. Instead, I chose a different line, one that would require patience and control. I promised myself I would protect Ethan, even if it meant biting back my anger and waiting for the right moment to act. And in the midst of this promise, another detail slid into view. One of the wedding vendors had sent a message addressed not just to Vanessa, but to Mr. Colin Hart, while another document listed C. Hargreaves as the contact for the same booking. The names didn't match, and the inconsistency lit a spark in my mind. For the first time, I realized the cracks in Vanessa's fairy tale weren't only about money. Something far stranger and more dangerous was hiding beneath the surface, and I had just stumbled onto the first hint of it. The more I studied the charges, the more deliberate I became in my response, and instead of panicking or canceling everything at once, I decided to take control in a way that would give me both clarity and leverage. I contacted the bank and requested a new digital clone of my credit card, one I could monitor with spending caps and instant alerts, so that every time Vanessa or her groom tried to use it, I would know in real time exactly where the money was going. It wasn't enough to stop her theft outright, not yet, because cutting her off too soon would only drive her into deeper deception. But letting her run on a leash I controlled would give me the proof I needed and buy me the chance to expose her scheme when it mattered most. Quietly, I renamed the account inside my banking app with a private label only I would recognize, a breadcrumb that reminded me this wasn't just survival, this was strategy. Days later, my patience was rewarded when a wedding planner sent me a contract confirmation, and as I scanned the details, one line made me pause. The contact was listed as Colin Hart, Vanessa's groom, which matched what I knew, but another vendor forwarded an invoice showing the name C. Hargreaves. My mind caught on that inconsistency like a nail-tearing fabric. 2 different names, 2 different identities, both tied to the same man who claimed to be Vanessa's perfect partner. I sat at my desk, staring at the documents, feeling the weight of a new possibility pressing down on me. What if Colin wasn't just careless with paperwork? What if he was building layers, escape hatches, ways to vanish when it suited him? The thought chilled me, even as it sharpened my focus, because suddenly Vanessa's theft of my card wasn't the only danger in this story. The discovery gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks, a spark of hope, the sense that maybe I wasn't powerless, maybe there was a way to turn this entire mess back on her. If Vanessa was reckless and her groom was hiding behind false names, then they weren't invincible, they were sloppy, and sloppy people leave trails. I began cataloging every receipt, every charge, every inconsistency, printing copies and filing them in a binder that grew thicker by the day. Each page became a piece of armor, protecting me from their lies, and each timestamp felt like a stone laid in a path that would eventually lead to the truth. For the first time, I felt less like a victim and more like a witness building her case, waiting for the right moment when the mask would slip and everyone would see them for who they really were. What gave me even more resolve was a clause I spotted buried deep in the venue contract, a paragraph most people would skip, but I read every line. It stated clearly that if any payment was traced back to fraudulent or unauthorized use, the venue had the right to cancel services immediately and alert all other vendors. I sat back, my lips curling into a smile I hadn't felt in weeks, because I realized I had just found the trapdoor beneath their stage. All I had to do was wait, quietly, patiently, letting Vanessa and Colin build their glittering castle on stolen sand, and when the time came, I would pull the foundation out from under them with nothing more than a phone call. The thought calmed me, steadied me, and I knew then that this wasn't only about protecting my money anymore. It was about justice, and for once in my life, I had the upper hand. Once the spark of clarity settled inside me, I knew I couldn't waste it, because Vanessa's greed and Colin's lies were only growing bolder, and the longer I waited without structure, the more they would drain both my patience and my account. So I built a plan the same way I build a budget, step by step, detail by detail, until every piece had its place. I started with documentation, printing out every charge with timestamps, highlighting vendor names, cross-referencing them with invoices, and creating a binder thick enough to rival a college textbook. I slipped dividers between sections, labeled each one carefully, and even added a color-coded index, because if this plan was going to succeed, it had to be airtight. I thought of it less as revenge and more as a kind of insurance, a guarantee that when the time came, I would not be left stumbling over half-truths and guesses, but would have the full story lined up like dominoes ready to fall. The next step was communication, but not with Vanessa. Talking to her directly would only trigger another wave of manipulation, another round of her dramatic sighs and clever distractions that had fooled so many people before. Instead, I reached out quietly to the bank's fraud department, not to close the card yet, but to flag it with a note that allowed me to track every unauthorized attempt. I also contacted the venue manager under the guise of confirming a detail, and in that conversation I learned how seriously they took their payment clauses. It was a small exchange, polite and businesslike, but it told me what I needed to know. If the moment came, they would stand by me when I pulled the thread. The calm in their voice gave me strength, because I realized I wasn't alone in this. Vanessa might think she controlled the narrative, but the truth was quietly stacking itself on my side, brick by brick. I added another layer to the plan by arranging a discreet call with the florist, setting it for the very morning of the wedding. My request was simple, to confirm that the payment details matched the authorized account. The florist didn't suspect a thing, but I knew that when the time came, their confirmation would serve as the spark that lit the fuse. I even spoke with the venue's audiovisual technician, asking casually about slideshow capabilities, all while pretending I was helping my sister prepare a sentimental display of childhood photos. In reality, I was preparing something entirely different, a sequence of evidence that could be revealed to the entire room with the push of a button. The idea wasn't just to stop Vanessa's theft, but to make her answer for it publicly, in the very moment she craved attention most. That thought filled me with a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. The final piece came unexpectedly, when a bridal boutique owner mentioned that she recognized Colin's face, but swore she had dealt with him under a different name in another city. She didn't have details, only a nagging familiarity, but that was enough to confirm my growing suspicion. This man wasn't just a fiancé, he was a fraud in his own right, weaving stories across places and people, leaving trails that only the patient could follow. I filed the information into my binder, tucking it next to the inconsistent contracts, and felt my resolve sharpen. Vanessa had chosen greed over loyalty, and Colin had chosen deceit over honesty, but I had chosen preparation. Every charge, every careless slip, every arrogant assumption they made was fuel for the moment when the spotlight would finally burn them instead of me, and I promised myself I would be ready when that day came. By the time I finished building my binder, the weight of it in my hands felt almost symbolic, as if all those neat dividers and printed statements were more than just papers. They were the armor I had been missing all my life when facing my sister's endless appetite. And maybe this is the moment to tell you, if you've ever been the one in your family who keeps everything together, the one who makes the lists, pays the bills, cooks the meals, and still finds yourself painted as the boring one, then please know that you are not invisible, and I see you. If stories like this one remind you of your own battles and you'd like to help me keep creating more of them, a quick like or even a comment means more than you think. It's not just a button on a screen to me. It's the encouragement that keeps me going, the reminder that I'm not telling these stories into a void, but to people who truly understand. I admit, part of me had to laugh at myself during those long evenings of preparation, because I went so far with the details that even my label maker nearly overheated. I caught myself alphabetizing receipts, color-coding contracts, and triple-checking timestamps, and I thought, only I could turn my sister's attempt to rob me into a full-scale research project. It was absurd, but the humor gave me strength. Sometimes I even imagined what Vanessa would say if she saw me sitting cross-legged on my living room floor surrounded by binders and sticky notes. She would probably roll her eyes and call me obsessive, but what she didn't know was that every little tab, every highlighted line, was another nail in the coffin of her perfect illusion. That binder gave me control, but it also gave me something else: patience. For once in my life, I wasn't reacting to Vanessa's chaos in panic or exhaustion. I was moving with calm purpose, laying my own foundation while she built her castle in the clouds, and I realized something powerful in that quiet. All my years of being the responsible one, the planner, the saver, the one mocked for living small, had prepared me for this exact moment. My discipline wasn't boring, it was my weapon, and every time I slipped another piece of evidence into its place, I felt the balance shifting in my favor. What she saw as dullness was turning into strategy, and I could almost taste the justice that was coming. And just as my confidence began to settle, another clue slipped into my hands, like fate giving me a nod. A woman from out of state responded to a discreet inquiry I had sent about Colin's alternate name, and in her email she confirmed that she had once been engaged to a man who matched his description perfectly. Her story was vague, scattered with pain she clearly didn't want to revisit, but her message contained a detail I couldn't ignore. He had disappeared the week before their wedding, leaving behind unpaid bills and unanswered calls. My heart thudded as I read her words, because it wasn't just Vanessa stealing from me anymore. It was her groom building a life on lies, and I had just uncovered the first thread of the web he thought he had hidden forever. I couldn't get the image of Ethan out of my head, the way his small frame seemed swallowed up by guilt as he slipped into my hallway, eyes darting like a trapped bird, shoulders curled inward as if he could make himself invisible. That shaky footage replayed in my mind over and over, and with each viewing I felt less fury at him and more sorrow that he had been pushed into such a role by his own mother. He wasn't the mastermind of this betrayal. He was just a child following orders, learning lessons no 15-year-old should ever be taught, and it hit me with a heavy clarity that if someone didn't step in, he would carry those lessons far longer than the sting of stolen money. So instead of lashing out, instead of storming into Vanessa's home demanding answers, I chose a different path. I invited him to my house one quiet evening, framing it as nothing more than pizza and homework, and when he arrived, his sneakers squeaked on the kitchen tile like a sound too loud for his own comfort. He sat at my table, hunched low, tearing the crust off his slice as if the act of eating was punishment, and I knew then that this boy didn't need my wrath, he needed my compassion. We talked slowly at first, circling the truth as if it were a hot stove neither of us wanted to touch. But finally, the words spilled out of him in bursts. He admitted that he hadn't wanted to take my card, that he had begged his mother not to involve him, but she had insisted, and in the end, he felt he had no choice. His voice cracked when he said he hated lying to me, hated sneaking into my hallway, but he didn't know how to stop her. As I listened, my anger at Vanessa hardened into something almost unshakable, because what kind of mother uses her own son as a tool to commit theft? It wasn't just about the card anymore. It was about corruption, about the rot she was planting in her own child's heart. I reached across the table and slid a notebook toward him, asking him to write down what happened, not as evidence to hold over his head, but as a way of freeing himself, of setting the truth down on paper so he could stop carrying it inside his chest. He looked up at me, eyes wet and unsure, but then he nodded and began to write, his pen moving quickly at first, and then more slowly, each word pulling a little of the weight off his shoulders. When he handed it back, he looked lighter, and I told him simply that I would protect him, that his mistakes would not define him, and that I would not let his mother's greed ruin his future. That promise changed something in both of us. For years, I had let Vanessa's storms drag me under, allowed her to decide when I was the villain and when I was the savior. But sitting there across from Ethan, I realized I had a new purpose. I wasn't just cleaning up after her anymore. I was building a shield for the one person in her household who still had a chance to break free. Ethan's quiet relief, the way his shoulders uncurled just a little, gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. And as if the universe was rewarding that clarity, my phone buzzed with another alert, another charge from a wedding vendor, this time for a luxury champagne order placed late at night. Instead of dread, I felt a strange calm wash over me, because now every new attempt was simply another piece of proof stacking up neatly in my binder. She thought she was bleeding me dry, but the truth was, she was feeding me exactly what I needed, leaving behind a breadcrumb trail so obvious even she couldn't deny it when the moment came. I was no longer panicking at each ping from my phone. I was collecting ammunition, and still the story deepened. In one contract buried beneath the standard fine print, I noticed a note about last-minute coordination with the audiovisual technician at the venue, and a thought sparked in my mind that made my pulse quicken. I had already spoken to that technician once, pretending to be the dutiful sister helping to prepare a slideshow of happy memories, but what if that slideshow became something else entirely? What if, instead of nostalgia and smiling childhood photos, the screen revealed invoices, dual names, inconsistent contracts, the truth she worked so hard to hide? The idea felt almost electric, not just because it promised justice, but because it promised it in the most public way possible, in the very moment Vanessa craved attention most. And I knew, deep in my bones, that patience would be my greatest weapon. Vanessa was too arrogant to imagine I had the courage to expose her. Colin was too slick to notice that his lies were unraveling, and Ethan, at least, was no longer their pawn, but a boy I had quietly pulled onto my side. The web was tightening, not around me, but around them, and I was ready to watch it close. The inconsistencies around Colin's name had gnawed at me for days, and I couldn't rest until I dug deeper, because every instinct in me screamed that this man wasn't who he claimed to be. Late at night, after work, I pored over public records, traced vendor contracts, and cross-checked his supposed background, only to find gaps wide enough to swallow an ocean. His social media presence was suspiciously thin for a man in his 30s, with only a handful of staged photos that looked like they had been lifted from a brochure. His supposed employer had no trace of him. His address history skipped across states in ways that made no sense, and each time I pressed for details, the story unraveled further. The more I searched, the clearer it became. Colin wasn't just careless, he was calculated, building false lives like a magician shuffling cards, confident no one would ever look closely enough to notice the duplicates. The turning point came when I received an email from a woman in another state who responded to the quiet inquiries I had sent under the guise of verifying vendor credentials. She told me she had once been engaged to a man who looked exactly like Colin, but she had known him by the name Christopher Hargreaves. Her message was hesitant at first, full of pain she clearly hadn't wanted to revisit, but as she explained, the pieces clicked into place. He had charmed her, proposed quickly, planned an elaborate wedding, and then disappeared without a trace just days before the ceremony, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and a devastated family who had believed his every word. My stomach dropped as I read her story, because it was like watching Vanessa's future written out in advance, and I realized she wasn't marrying a prince. She was walking straight into the arms of a professional predator. I called her, needing to hear her voice, to know for certain this wasn't some wild mistake, and the tremor in her words was enough to convince me. She described the same smile, the same easy charm, the same way he could win over a room with a few carefully chosen compliments. She remembered how he checked exits at restaurants, how he insisted on handling all the vendor contracts himself, how he kept a small black bag in the trunk of his car with clothes and cash, just in case. When she told me that detail, my heart skipped, because I had already noticed the way he hovered near the parking lot at family gatherings, as if guarding something out of sight. The realization hit like a bolt of lightning. Vanessa's dream wedding wasn't just being funded with stolen money, it was being staged as the perfect cover for his next escape. Armed with this truth, the anger that had been simmering in me transformed into something sharper, colder, and more controlled. This wasn't just about Vanessa stealing from me anymore. It was about exposing a man who had built his life on deception, a man who had likely left a trail of broken promises and financial wreckage behind him. And suddenly, the thought of stopping him wasn't just personal. It felt bigger, like justice not only for myself, but for every woman who had fallen for his charm and been left with nothing. The irony was almost poetic. Vanessa, so consumed by greed and appearances, was about to be humiliated not by me, but by the very man she thought would elevate her status. All I had to do was keep building my case, keep my silence until the stage was set, and then let the truth drop like a hammer in the one place she least expected it, in front of every person she had gathered to admire her. The morning of the wedding arrived with a heavy sky, clouds hanging low as if the world itself was holding its breath, and I felt that same weight pressing on me as I prepared myself for what was about to unfold. I had rehearsed my plan a dozen times in my head, walking through each step until it felt almost mechanical, and yet my pulse still thudded with the nervous energy of knowing there would be no second chances. I slipped the thick binder into a plain black bag, its neatly labeled sections stacked like soldiers ready for inspection, and double-checked the flash drive that held my carefully arranged slideshow. Each file was named, each page timed, each piece of evidence lined up in a sequence that would be impossible to deny once it hit the screen. I dressed simply, a navy dress with clean lines, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, because my goal wasn't to shine that day. It was to let the truth shine brighter than any crystal chandelier Vanessa had rented for her big moment. When I arrived at the venue, I was greeted by a flurry of vendors rushing in and out, carrying flowers, adjusting linens, balancing trays of sparkling glasses, all of them unaware that their perfect setup balanced on the edge of collapse. I found the venue manager first, slipping her an envelope with printed instructions and my contact information, explaining calmly that there might be a payment discrepancy to verify later, and though her eyes widened slightly, she nodded with the kind of professional steadiness that reassured me she would be ready when I gave the signal. From there, I sought out the audiovisual technician, shaking his hand with the same polite smile I had practiced, confirming the details of the family slideshow that was scheduled for later in the reception. He didn't need to know what it truly contained, only that the files worked, and as the test images flickered briefly across the large screen, I felt a surge of control. The tools were in place, the players were set, and all that remained was patience. I settled into my seat in the third row, blending into the hum of guests as they trickled in, adjusting their outfits, whispering about the beauty of the hall, completely oblivious to the storm about to break. I held myself perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my expression calm, but inside I felt a current of energy crackling through me like static before a thunderclap. From where I sat, I could see Vanessa in the distance, laughing with her bridesmaids, her gown glittering under the chandeliers, her smile as wide as ever. She looked radiant, confident, absolutely certain that the day belonged to her, and for a fleeting moment I almost pitied her. She had built her castle of lies so high that she couldn't imagine it collapsing, and it was that blindness, that arrogance, that made her vulnerable. I scanned the room again, my eyes catching on Colin near the aisle, adjusting his tie with that same smooth expression. But then I noticed something that sent a chill through me. He checked the exits, twice, his gaze darting to the side doors as if memorizing his escape routes. That single gesture confirmed everything I had feared, and everything I had prepared for. He wasn't here to start a marriage. He was here to stage another performance, to charm, to collect, and then to vanish. I reached into my bag and brushed my fingers lightly against the edge of the binder, reminding myself that I wasn't powerless anymore, that I wasn't watching helplessly from the sidelines as Vanessa and her groom built their illusion. I had every receipt, every contract, every alert, and every thread that tied them to their lies, and I was ready to pull those threads until the whole fabric unraveled in front of everyone. As the music swelled and guests began to turn toward the aisle, I inhaled slowly, steadying myself, because I knew that before the day was over, the spotlight Vanessa had stolen for herself would become her greatest punishment. The ceremony began with a flourish so theatrical it could have been staged for a magazine spread, the aisle overflowing with roses and flickering candles, the string quartet playing softly as guests rose to their feet in admiration. Vanessa moved forward like a queen on parade, her gown glittering under the chandeliers, her smile wide and unshakable, convinced that every eye in the room was on her for all the right reasons. Colin stood at the altar with his practiced grin, his posture polished, every gesture rehearsed, and I could see why so many had fallen under his spell. To anyone else, it looked like a perfect match, the golden couple about to seal their fate in elegance. But as the officiant spoke of love and devotion, my pulse quickened because I knew the perfection was fragile, a glass ornament seconds away from shattering. The binder at my side and the slideshow queued up on the screen behind them were more powerful than any words I could say, and I sat silently, waiting for the moment when illusion would collapse into truth. When the vows reached the part where rings were to be exchanged, the first fracture appeared. The venue manager, calm yet commanding, stepped forward and interrupted with a firm announcement. There was a payment discrepancy that required immediate clarification. The string quartet faltered mid-note, the hum of whispers swelled into a collective gasp, and the room shifted as hundreds of eyes turned toward the bride and groom. Vanessa's smile froze on her face, the corners twitching downward as color drained from her cheeks, and I watched her fingers tighten around the bouquet until her knuckles turned white. Colin's reaction was sharper, a flick of the eyes toward the side exit, a tightening of his jaw, a subtle step backward that spoke volumes. In those few seconds, tension rippled through the guests, some leaning forward in confusion, others already beginning to murmur suspicions. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rustle of dresses and the shifting of shoes on polished floors, a silence that begged for someone to explain, and that was when the real storm began. The large screen at the back of the hall flickered to life, at first showing harmless family photos just as everyone expected. Images of Vanessa smiling at birthdays, snapshots of Ethan as a child, scenes of holidays carefully curated to soften the mood. But then, almost imperceptibly, the slideshow shifted. Instead of family snapshots, a screenshot appeared, my bank alert, time-stamped and marked as fraudulent. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd, then another slide followed. An invoice signed by Colin Hart, immediately replaced by another signed by C. Hargreaves. Gasps grew louder as more slides rolled out, each one sharper than the last. Charges routed through my controlled card. Statements highlighting the pattern of theft. Documents showing the same man hiding under two names. The whispers became shouts. Guests craning their necks, some rising to their feet to see more clearly. Vanessa's expression collapsed into horror, her lips moving as if forming excuses that never made it past her throat, while Colin's mask cracked entirely. He glared at the screen, then at me, his composure unraveling as he realized the evidence was undeniable. And then, the moment of final collapse arrived. From the back of the room, a woman I had contacted weeks earlier, the former fiancée, stepped forward with a calmness that silenced even the loudest murmurs. She spoke his other name clearly, firmly, cutting through the chaos like a bell. Christopher Hargreaves. The name hung in the air, heavy with recognition, and the entire room turned to Colin as if waiting for his denial. But his face betrayed him. The wide eyes, the stiff posture, the sudden desperate glance toward the blocked exits. Guests gasped again, louder now, some shouting in outrage, others clutching at one another's arms in disbelief. Vanessa staggered backward, her perfect gown tangling around her feet, her bouquet slipping from her trembling hands onto the polished floor. Colin tried to push through the crowd, but the venue staff I had warned were already in place, blocking the doors with quiet efficiency. The hall erupted into chaos. Voices rising, accusations flying, the sound of truth filling every corner of the room. And through it all, I sat in my seat, calm and steady, the weight of years of injustice lifting from my shoulders as I watched my sister and her groom's empire of lies collapse in front of the very audience they had hoped to dazzle. The aftermath of the collapse felt like standing in the eye of a storm, where everything that had been hidden was now swirling in plain sight, impossible to deny or contain. The hall that only moments earlier had been filled with admiration and polite smiles, now buzzed with chaos, whispers, and outrage that rose and fell like crashing waves. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others rising abruptly, eager to escape the humiliation of being associated with such a scandal. A few even pulled out their phones, no doubt texting friends or posting discreet updates that would soon travel faster than wildfire. Vanessa remained frozen at the altar, her hands trembling around the bouquet that now seemed more like a prop from a failed performance than the crown jewel of her perfect day. Her face was pale beneath the heavy makeup, her wide eyes darting from guest to guest, as if begging someone to defend her, but no one spoke up. And Colin, or Christopher, found himself flanked by two security officers the venue had stationed quietly near the back, men who moved with calm efficiency as though they had seen hundreds of liars like him before. His voice rose in protest, words spilling about mistakes and misunderstandings, but the evidence glowed larger than life on the screen behind him, and not even the smoothest tongue could talk its way past that truth. The fallout spread outward with breathtaking speed. Within hours, the bank completed its review and reversed every fraudulent charge, returning my funds and freezing all future attempts. The vendors, alerted and furious, pulled their services instantly, some storming into the hall to retrieve their items, others shaking their heads in disgust as they realized they had nearly been scammed. The venue canceled its contract on the spot, leaning on the very clause I had memorized, and their manager's voice carried a quiet triumph as she told Vanessa that no event under their roof would be tainted with fraud. Even more cutting was the way guests reacted, not with sympathy, but with open condemnation. Women who had once envied Vanessa's taste whispered that they always suspected she was living beyond her means. Men muttered about arrogance and vanity, and relatives who had once defended her looked away, their silence louder than any accusation. As for Colin, his so-called go-bag was discovered by security within minutes, stuffed with cash, spare phones, and a set of IDs under different names. That discovery sealed his fate. Authorities were called, and before the evening was over, he was escorted away, not as a groom, but as a criminal whose pattern of fraud had finally caught up with him. Vanessa's humiliation was something both brutal and inevitable. At first, she tried to reclaim the stage, her voice rising shrilly as she pointed her shaking finger at me, accusing me of jealousy, of plotting to ruin her day, of being so bitter about my small life that I had destroyed hers. But the words fell flat in a room where everyone had seen the evidence projected in undeniable detail. Not one person came to her defense. Even our own mother, who for years had urged me to keep peace and help my sister because family is everything, sat stiff in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line, unable to justify what had just unfolded. Vanessa's accusations quickly dissolved into sobs, her shoulders shaking as she tried to gather the scraps of dignity left to her, but there was nothing left to salvage. She had gambled on her greed and arrogance, and the entire community had witnessed her lose. When she finally fell silent, bouquet abandoned on the floor, gown wrinkled from her collapse into the nearest chair, she no longer looked like the radiant bride she had worked so hard to portray. She looked like what she truly was, a woman exposed, stripped bare by her own choices. For me, the true resolution came not from the public vindication, though it was powerful, but from the quiet strength of finally drawing boundaries that had been blurred for too long. In the days that followed, I made it clear that Vanessa would receive no more rescues from me. No loans, no shared accounts, no silent repairs to the messes she created. I met her rage with calm silence, her pleas with steady refusal, and for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch under her guilt or her tears. She would carry her debts, she would answer for her actions, and I would not be the one holding the broom to sweep up her wreckage. Ethan, on the other hand, I treated differently. I took him into my home for weekends, gave him space to breathe, and gently reminded him that he was not defined by the mistakes his mother forced on him. Together, one afternoon, we shredded the last of the fraudulent documents, and when the shredder jammed on a glitter-covered wedding program, we laughed so hard that tears streamed down our faces. That laughter felt like the truest victory of all, a moment of release, of freedom, proof that the cycle had finally been broken. And as I looked at him, lighter, freer, no longer hunched under shame, I knew that exposing Vanessa and her groom hadn't just saved me, it had saved him too. In the weeks that followed the wedding that never was, the noise of gossip eventually began to settle, though the echoes of that day lingered like a cautionary tale told at every dinner table in town. People whispered in the grocery store aisles, shook their heads at the salon, and clucked their tongues over coffee, each retelling of the fiasco making Vanessa smaller in their eyes and the truth clearer in mine. For the first time in years, I felt the freedom of waking up without dread, without wondering what new disaster my sister might drag me into, and without bracing myself for another favor disguised as obligation. The weight I had carried on my shoulders for so long had been lifted, and what replaced it was a calm sense of balance I hadn't realized I had been missing. Life was not suddenly glamorous or glittering, but it was mine, fully and finally mine. With my finances restored and my binder of evidence tucked safely away, I found myself laughing at how anticlimactic my daily life felt in comparison. I went back to my routines, balancing spreadsheets at work, tending to my small garden on weekends, and clipping coupons out of habit even though I didn't really need to anymore. Stability had never felt so sweet, and though some might have found it boring, I cherished every quiet moment of it. Out of a small gesture of closure, I bought myself a new wallet, sturdy leather with a clasp that snapped shut firmly, and I tucked it into the drawer where my old one had sat, replacing the place where betrayal had once lived with something strong and reliable. And because I couldn't resist a touch of humor, I donated my overworked label maker to the local PTA, telling them it deserved a happier job tagging school supplies instead of fraud. Vanessa kept her distance, her pride too wounded to face me openly, though I heard through the grapevine that she was slowly untangling the debts left behind and had started attending counseling under pressure from both family and creditors. Whether she would truly change, I didn't know, but I no longer felt responsible for the answer. Ethan, meanwhile, grew lighter each day, his laughter more genuine when he visited, his shoulders straighter as he began to find hobbies and friends that had nothing to do with his mother's chaos. Watching him heal was the truest reward I could have asked for. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is break the cycle and choose a different path. He once asked me shyly if I thought people could start over, and I told him without hesitation that they could, because I had seen both sides, the ruin that greed brings and the peace that truth restores. And if there is one thing I learned from it all, it is that greed always comes with a bill, and sooner or later it finds its way to the right doorstep. My sister thought she could live forever on borrowed money and stolen chances, but life has a way of balancing the scales, even when it takes years to happen. My final thought for anyone listening is simple. Never underestimate the power of quiet patience, of small truths stacked neatly until they become undeniable. In the end, the loudest person in the room may not be the strongest, and the one mocked for living simply may be the one who stands tall when the storm is over. Justice doesn't always arrive in a dramatic flash, but when it does, it leaves behind a peace sweeter than any champagne fountain could ever offer. And as I sit in my quiet townhouse now, sipping tea in the soft light of evening, I can tell you with a smile that stability, honesty, and a clear conscience are worth more than all the chandeliers in the world. If you stayed with me until the very end, that already means the world to me, and I'd love to hear what you think. Stories like mine are not just words. They're reminders that so many of us have lived through family storms and found strength we didn't know we had. So if this touched you, let me know in the comments, share your thoughts, or even tell me if you've ever seen greed backfire the way it did here. And please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Your support really helps me keep creating more of these stories, and every single one of you makes this journey brighter.